Thank you, Ms. Sacalotto. I've got a few questions for the panel. First to Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, one of the things we've heard regularly today is that one of the fears here is that contractors will simply add this additional 3% to their bids, and as a result, prices will go up for everybody, including the taxpayer. But I understand from your testimony, I think you mentioned it briefly, that it's actually worse than that. In your industry, you can't do that. Is that right?
That's correct.
Tell me why that is.
Our margins are so tight now, there's always somebody that's willing to take the job cheaper, as Mr. Gaffney said, for 1%. And normally a added cost you would pass on, but in this industry and in the market we're in now, you just can't do it. So it's just something else we're going to have to absorb, another brick we're going to have to put in our load.
You and Mr. Gaffney both mentioned the concept of retainage, which I'm familiar with, but I'm not sure everybody else here is. When you tell us a little bit about how that works, how retainage works generally.
Okay, we have a contract with a entity like the City of Rock Hill, say $5 million. Well, the first pay request we send in is say for $100,000. Well, they pay us $90,000 of that $100,000. They hold the other 10% until the project is complete and you've passed certain milestones. So over the course of that project, it'll go whatever the progress payments are. By the end of the project, they've got $500,000 of your money.
But you get that money upon completion.
Right. It's up to us. When we finish, the sooner we finish, the sooner we get the money. With this money, we're leaving it up to our good friends here in Washington to decide when and how we're going to get it.
And that's what I think a lot of people don't understand about the proposals, is that retainage, which everyone in the industry is familiar with, you get when the project is finished. This 3% withholding is different. You don't get this 3% withholding back until you pay your taxes for the year in which the project finished. So you could finish a project in January of 2012 and not actually get your money until April 15th of 2013. So it's not retainage. I've heard a lot of people say that this is similar to retainage. It's just another 3% retainage, and it's actually much worse than that. We've asked a couple of folks. I'll ask Mr. Frost, Mr. Gaffney, and Ms. Sacalotto as well, because I think you mentioned the legalities of this. Why is another short-term extension not a solution? And I'll put that to anyone who wants to speak to it.
For me personally, the problem I have is we just can't afford, if I'm bidding a project that's going on for 2 years or 3 years, and this could be implemented in the middle of the project, we're having to walk away from it. So I'm not bidding the work today for any of the long-term projects just because of the fear that this could come into play in the back end of the project, in the last year of the project. We just can't afford it. I just couldn't do that. So that's why it's impacting us today.
Ms. Sacalotto?
Sure. Well, contracts every day are being entered into, and some of those contracts are long-term contracts. They're not just for the next couple of years. They're for the next 5, 7, 10 years. And there are no provisions in the Federal Acquisition Regulation now that implement this 3% withholding. Yet there are plenty of provisions that require the government to pay its bills on time and pay them in full. So we have a lot of instability in the market right now as contractors are trying to figure out, well, how am I going to deal with this? And contracting officers don't really have the tools necessary. As we can see, people are still trying to figure out how to implement this. So as contracts are being entered into now, there's a great deal of uncertainty. So having instability in any market is obviously not a positive thing.
And let me add to that, if I may. You mentioned that if it was delayed, would that be helpful? And of course, there would be some advantage there. But you heard the gentleman from the Department of Defense speak to the fact that they're already planning for that and incurring costs associated with that planning, as is the industry. And so if we're incurring costs when the ultimate outcome is going to hopefully be repeal of that mandate, then why not repeal it now?
And I think Mr. Loftus said the same thing. The states are doing the same thing in anticipation of it
Exactly.
possibly coming to. Mr. Murphy, you had an addition?
To me, put it off another day doesn't help because it's still a bad policy. It's not going to be any better a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now.
Mr. Murphy, you mentioned one thing, and this will be my final question, that caught my attention. You mentioned that the average margin to a contractor of your size, 3.2%, I think you mentioned. And then you mentioned that for a lot of the subs who are smaller than you, it was down as low as 1.6%. And I think that drove home for me how dramatic the impact, while the impact of this bill would be felt industry-wide, the smaller the business, the more dramatic it would be. How would your subs be able to operate under this system?
Like Mr. Gaffney said, some of these you wouldn't be able to pass it on to them. They just go out of business. Because a lot of these guys that we deal with, concrete finishers and some mason stuff, you have to pay them every week. If you hold 3% for a year on them, they would just go out of business, or they'd quit doing work with you.
Thank you very much. I'll recognize Mrs. Chu for as much time as she would like.